So what exactly happens inside the brain when an opioid overdose literally stops a person's breath? It's a terrifying, high-stakes question, right? And it sits right at the center of the global health crisis we're all too familiar with. We hear the staggering statistics all the time. But today, we're zooming way, way in. We're talking the microscopic, cellular science of how these molecules completely hijack our neural pathways. And, more importantly, how emergency pharmacology can literally snatch a life back from the brink.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into opioids, from molecules to emergency medicine. We are going to take a fascinating journey from the microscopic biology inside your cells straight into the high-pressure life-or-death environment of the ER.
To get there, here's our roadmap. We'll start with the mu receptor mechanism, then look at chronic exposure and adaptation, map out the anatomy of withdrawal, hit acute opioid overdose, and finally wrap up with emergency reversal. Mastering this hard cellular science first is absolutely the key to understanding how we actually save lives later on.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, the mu receptor mechanism.
Okay, let's break this down step by step so it doesn't feel like a biochemistry lecture. When an opioid hits the brain, it locks onto a very specific target, the mu receptor. This connection kicks off a chain reaction, activating these GI/O proteins. You can think of them as a massive cellular stop sign for an enzyme called adenylyl cyclase. Because of this, the production of CAMP, a really critical cellular messenger, just plummets, and it drags another protein, pKa, right down with it.
So what's the actual result of this whole molecular cascade? Well, inwardly rectifying potassium channels fly open. Potassium rushes out, the neuron hyperpolarizes, and its electrical firing literally just ceases. It shuts down. And when this cellular silencing hits a specific part of the brainstem called the locus coeruleus, that's exactly when we see the classic clinical effects we expect from opioids: profound sedation and intense pain relief.
Now let's shift gears to part 2, chronic exposure and adaptation.
We just saw that with a single acute exposure, opioids suppress that CMP cascade. But, our brains are incredibly adaptable. Over weeks or months of chronic exposure, the brain realizes, hey, I'm being artificially silenced here. So to fight back, the locus coeruleus drastically upregulates its CMP-PKA-CREB cascade. It starts building more and more enzymes just to push through that drug-induced inhibitory wall. And this right here, this is the absolute biological foundation of opioid tolerance.
The best way to think about it is like this. The brain acts like a biological thermostat, constantly striving for homeostasis or balance. If opioids are constantly pushing the temperature down, chilling the whole nervous system into sedation, the brain's thermostat adapts by cranking its own internal furnace all the way up to compensate.
Which leads us right into part 3, the anatomy of withdrawal. So what happens if you suddenly remove that opioid? Well, you instantly lose that inhibition. But remember, the brain's internal furnace is still blasting at maximum capacity. Without the drug holding everything back, that highly upregulated CAMP and CREB pathway causes completely unopposed noradrenergic hyperactivity. The locus coeruleus essentially wakes up in a panic and just starts firing completely out of control.
And that microscopic electrical storm translates directly into absolute physical misery. Just 8 to 10 hours after the last dose, withdrawal sets in. We're talking tearing eyes, yawning, profound chills, severe nausea, and hyperpenia, which is rapid breathing. And here's a really wild fact. Up to 50% of a person's risk for experiencing these really severe withdrawal symptoms is actually tied to their genetics, specifically variations in their mu receptor gene.
All right, part 4, acute opioid overdose. This is where things get incredibly urgent. In an overdose, that mu receptor suppression goes lethally far. The neurons in the brainstem that literally tell us to breathe become totally insensitive to carbon dioxide. Respirations slow down to a dangerous crawl. You'll see pinpoint pupils, bradycardia, severe hypothermia, and a rapid slide straight into a coma. And because the gag reflex is completely lost, the risk of aspiration pneumonia just absolutely skyrockets. If you look at this, it's fascinating how the clinical signs perfectly mirror what's happening at the cellular level. When the biological thermostat is pushed to extreme cold in an overdose, breathing is slow, pupils are pinpoint, the heart rate plummets, and the patient is comatose. But flip over to withdrawal. When the drug is totally gone and the thermostat is blasting heat, we see the exact symmetrical opposite. We see rapid breathing, dilated pupils, a racing heart, and severe agitation. It's a perfect contrast.
Okay, we know what the crisis looks like. Let's move to part 5, emergency reversal and management.
When a patient hits the ER doors, the very first step is always securing the airway and getting them ventilated. Then we hit them with the antidote, naloxone. This is a pure antagonist. It rushes into the brain, literally kicks the opioid right off the mu receptors, and restores breathing in just 1 to 2 minutes. It's a miracle drug, but the catch is incredibly perilous. Naloxone's half-life is super short. Because a lot of opioids outlast it in the system, you need continuous monitoring and often repeat dosing, or even an IV drip, just to keep the patient from slipping right back into a coma.
Now check out this number, because this is where modern reality hits hard. Historically, a standard dose of naloxone was maybe 0.4 milligrams, but today, look at that massive 10 milligram jump. Because the illicit drug supply is so heavily contaminated with ultra-potent synthetic opioids like fentanyl, emergency responders are frequently having to push massive amounts of naloxone just to get a single patient breathing again. It's a whole new ballgame.
So beyond the immediate, acute crisis, how do we actually treat the underlying disorder? Well, that brings us to a seriously brilliant piece of pharmacology, the partial agonist. A drug like buprenorphine binds to the mu receptor, but it doesn't activate it 100%. At low doses, it gives just enough stimulation to fend off withdrawal. But, and here's the magic, as you increase the dose, its antagonist properties start to take over, creating what we call a clinical ceiling effect. Because of this unique profile, a primary fatal overdose on buprenorphine is virtually impossible compared to a full agonist like heroin or methadone.
For long-term management, our clinical toolkit heavily relies on this specific pharmacodynamics. We've got methadone, which is a long-acting full agonist, and buprenorphine, our safer partial agonist. Then there's naltrexone, a pure antagonist that completely blocks future highs. And crucially, we use alpha-2 agonists like clonidine and lofecidine. Now think back to the beginning of our explainer. These specific drugs are amazing because they work by directly suppressing that unopposed noradrenergic hyperactivity we talked about in the locus coeruleus. They directly treat that exact cellular adaptation we mapped out earlier.
Which ultimately leaves us with a pretty profound challenge. If our brains are biologically wired to adapt so fiercely to these molecules, literally rewiring our own neurochemistry, how can we revolutionize our chemical antidotes to stay one step ahead of these increasingly potent synthetic opioids? The science of addiction is really a high-stakes race between human pharmacology and the incredible homeostatic power of the brain itself. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this deep dive completely changes the way you look at the opioid crisis.